Continuing with some explorations of the unified field equation that was derived a few weeks ago, I wanted to focus on the topic of innovation within that context. So, as a summary, in this equation we have three core matrices. It's the light matrix, space matrix, and time matrix. The light matrix specifies this deep codification in light of four essential powers, if you will, that then manifest in space in a certain sequence that's specified by this time matrix. We saw this play out at various levels of complexity. So starting at the electromagnetic level, we had the action of the four organizing principles codified in light, specifying how the electromagnetic field is organized. Jumping up a level of complexity to the quantum particle level, arguably at 10 to the minus 34 meters, we see that quantum particles themselves are architected along these four principles. Coming to the periodic table, we see again that there's the classification of the periodic table along these four principles, and that's at 10 to the minus 11 meters. And then coming to the cellular level, to the kind of barely visible level, 10 to the minus 6 meters, we again see this action, this fourfold action, creating the very molecular plans that animate any living cell. And so we can hypothesize that there's a very deep level of innovation that is happening at each of these levels, and that innovation is captured here. So the question is, how does this innovation really play out as we jump a few levels of complexity and get to the human level? And that's what we want to explore today. And at the human level, basically in contrast to these other layers that we had gone over in the emergence of matter, there's kind of an automaticity in the emergence of these layers that's specified by the actions of M3, M2, and M1. But when we get to the human collectivity level, there is the action of will that becomes implicit. That's a separation from the way that the system works. So that's kind of a looking on the system by the system itself to make it progress along certain dimensions or in certain ways. And that kind of self-looking action is represented by this movement from an untransformed series of sets represented by XU to a transformed series of sets represented by XT. And so if we think about innovation, then we may represent innovation essentially as being proportional to this action of the change from the sources of innovation represented by the untransformed set to the sources of innovation represented by the transformed set. So XU can be magnified along the physical, vital, mental, and integral dimensions. So are represented by physical, vital, mental, integral U. And then our end state is physical, vital, mental, integral along a relatively transformed set. But also as specified by this equation, this is a recursive function. So we see here that the output xt then feeds back into xu, and that becomes the next kind of wave of innovation that this equation will compute, if you will. And so the question then is, how does this action of innovation really take place? Because we're saying that there's this recursiveness, but what are the conditions by which this initial set transforms to a relatively transformed set? And the key, as specified in this equation, is the overcoming of certain patterns that are themselves set up by these sources of innovation. So for example, if we think about the untransformed physical set, this might be the attitude of inertia, or the untransformed vital set, it might be an aggressive, a self-seeking aggressiveness. If we think about the untransformed mental set, it might be a fragmentation in thought. Or the untransformed integral set, it might be seeking to integrate around a limited point of view. And as we begin to overcome these essential patterns that emanate themselves from the sources of innovation available to us, then we allow these deeper meta layers codified in light to become active. And so essentially we see the action of M1, M2, and M3, and as these become more active, then the elements that had surfaced begin to transform, and so we end up with a more progressive set of innovative sources in this in these transformed sets over here. And so we may also represent this equation in a more summary fashion by saying that innovation is a result of the action on U of the meta levels M1, M2, M3, and importantly, the four dimensions: presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Because let's not forget that the stability of each of these layers is a result of the integration or unification of these four principles along each of these levels of complexity. So essentially what we're saying is that there is an implicit action of love that is essential to create stability at any level, in the absence of which you would just have a number of independent forces that could never really amount to anything that would create a sustainable layer for the next layer of emergence to surface. If we wanted to represent this action of innovation, so here we're summarizing innovation as being here, but to kind of make it more concrete, I want to represent that in graph form. And we can think of this graph as having innovation along the y-axis, and I'll simplify along the x-axis having time, which is a surrogate for overcoming various patterns. And if we think about how innovation may play out at the human collectivity level, so if we just had this set active here, then innovation might be very choppy and low, and I'll just represent it by this kind of sinusoidal wave over here. But then as we overcome patterns and as M1 becomes active, perhaps this innovation rises like this. As M2 becomes active, it rises like this, M3, and then the action over here, perhaps innovation accelerates and begins to become much higher, and I'll represent this, the H for the human collectivity. I want to contrast this to innovation at the other levels, and I'll use the green. So for example, at the cellular level, what we may expect is innovation that has a similar curve but is lower in magnitude, and then similarly at the atomic level, it's perhaps represented here, at the quantum level represented here. The point being is that innovation goes through quantum leaps as there is a new layer of emergence possible, and the key factors again are these sets of M1 and M2. So let's think about that. So M2 is the set of elements around each of the four principles, organizational principles. So at the beginning, so if we're looking at the electromagnetic field, we may have a set that's synonymous with presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So it's a very small set. But then as we complexify, and as has been illustrated elsewhere, these sets diversify and multiply. So at the cellular level, you have a lot more functionality that presence means, and a lot more functionality that power means, and so on. And then as we get to human level, these essential sets complexify, become much vaster. And then we had said that M1 is a function of the number of elements in M2, and this is also specified by this codification here. And so what we would see at the human level is M1 reaching down over here. And so through the combined action of M1, M2, and this essential action of love represented by this union, innovation can go through vastly increased levels potentially.